Hi, welcome back. We're in Lecture 13, Segment 3. And in this segment, we're going to rerun the moderation analysis that we ran in Segment 1, but now that we know about centering, we're going to center our continuous predictor working memory capacity and see how that changes the results. So let's rerun that example. So just to remind you, in case you took a little time off between segments, the example we covered in segment 1 of this lecture was a moderation analysis where the predictor variable was an actual independent variable, a manipulation of stereotype threat, and the outcome variable was IQ score. And our theory was that there's a moderator, and that moderator is working memory capacity. And we saw evidence for that in the analysis we did in segment 1. So just to review, how do we test for moderation? We run two models. The first model doesn't include moderation terms, so it's just the categorical predictor using dummy codes and the continuous predictor. And then when we add in the moderation terms, we just take the product of the dummy codes and the continuous predictor. But wait, we just learned in segment 2 that if we have a continuous predictor, we have to center it, right? There's all sorts of reasons, the conceptual reasons, the statistical reasons. Did we have multi-collinearity going on in segment 1? So let's redo segment 1 the right way. So now I've just rewritten everything, but you'll see the only change is that I have z.center throughout. That's the working memory score centered. So that's the only change I made to the data. So I simply created a new column in my data frame in R, working memory centered, which just took the working memory scores and put them in deviation form. Okay? And what you'll see is this is going to make things a lot easier to interpret when we look at those regression coefficients. Again, to remind you, this was the simulated experiment. We had people perform, well, in our minds, we had people perform a working memory task first, then they were randomly assigned to one of the three conditions, and then they performed an IQ test. Again, the predictor variable x is categorical, so we need to dummy code, and this was the scheme we used. And here are the results from model 1 that we covered in segment 1. This is still uncentered. I'm just showing it to you again so we can see how the coefficients change when we go from uncentered to centered. So let's look at that. So here's model 1 now that we've centered working memory capacity. So up at the top, you can see when we ran the LM function, I now have a different variable. It's wm.centered. Everything else is the same. The one thing that changes, of course, is the regression constant, because it's the predicted score on y when all x's are 0. Well, 0 on WM centered is now the mean of working memory. So that's why this is much higher. We now have a sort of average IQ score there, whereas if you look back before when it was uncentered, we had this really odd IQ score of 59.78. Right? So just by centering, we get a regression constant that makes a lot more sense. And we can see the effects of stereotype threat. They're still there. They haven't changed at all, but they're just so much easier to wrap your head around, right? So they're on the same scale that you would plot in your graphics to show the results. But again, just to drive that home, if I go back from model 1 uncentered forward to model 1 centered, you should see the only change is in the regression constant. Everything else remains the same. The t-values, the p-values, the r-squared, everything. Because all I did was just change the scale to make it easier to read. So here's model 2 uncentered. We saw this in segment 1. Let's see how it compares to model 2 centered. Again, we just get changes in the regression constant. We do get a couple other changes now. So when you do centering, it's just a rule of thumb that the highest order terms in your regression model will not change. Those coefficients won't change. But things that fall below that may change. So what do I mean by that? Well, if we look at the essential regression coefficients for this analysis, those are the ones associated with the moderation terms, right? That's where we want to look when we do this analysis. We did this in segment 1. They're significant, right? Those do not change as a function of centering. But values above that may change. So there's some slight change in values above that. But below that, no changes. Okay? And again, the model R squared, exactly the same. So the last thing we want to do is model comparison, model 1 versus model 2. Here are the results from segment 1, where we were dealing with uncentered data. We had a nice result here in that we had a significant change in variance explained from model 1 to model 2. And of course, this is going to be exactly the same with the centered data. Absolutely the same. All of these numbers are the same because all I did was change the scale. So same exact F statistic, same exact p-value. Okay, all it's doing is changing the regression constants, making them easier to interpret.